The Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour, knead it, and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk and the calf that he had prepared and set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" He said, "There, in the tent." Then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have grown old, and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the set time I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. He said, "Oh yes, you did laugh." This is the word of the Lord. You know, I'm hoping this morning I'm not the only one who finds this narrative very strange indeed. Do any of you? There's an aura here. I can't tell whether there are 3 visitors or just one. Because as you may have noticed, the words change. It's as if there's just one, and then all of a sudden it's as if there are 3, and only one is identified as the Lord. Now that's one source of confusion. The other is prompted by the fact that for the first 8 verses, it's all about males. I mean, really, that's what it's about. Abraham gives orders, people scurry around, everything gets ready for these 3 guests who have shown up. And the 3 visitors who are identified, believe it or not, as men: Abraham himself, the promise of a son, Isaac. Well, happy Father's Day. But you know, it's a little bit more than that. If I had to say 2 things about this passage, what I'd say is it's about hospitality and it's about laughter. And those are 2 things we dare not do without, either as individuals or as a community of faith. So here's Abraham. Those first 8 verses, more than anything else, are about the hospitality to strangers who very strangely, suddenly show up while Abraham's sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. And he calls the visitors by a name that we see a lot in the Old Testament. "My Lord, if I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant." That's not Lord with a capital L. That's more like Sir. So he's speaking to these people as if they are just honored guests. Well, I'll tell you what's strange about this. Abraham is showing great hospitality. And throughout the entire Abraham saga, we only find 4 times in Scripture where Abraham is viewed positively. No, I'm serious. We think of him, oh yeah, the father of nations, he's really paid attention to God. But he's only viewed positively 4 times. One of them is when God tells him to leave his homeland, Ur of the Chaldees. The next one is the covenant where God declares he'll give him descendants. The third one is the bargaining with the Lord over Sodom. Do you remember that one? Okay, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to embarrass anybody. That's one of the times when he shows tremendous positive power. And the last one, strangely, is his willingness to follow God's commands to at least move in the direction of sacrificing Isaac. Implied by Sarah's comment, which she kind of laughs about quietly to herself, is that unlike his descendant Moses, Abraham has not remained vigorous into his old age. The message of the visitors would be received with very bitter humor indeed. So funny, I forgot to laugh. How many of you remember that from the playground when you were in elementary school? That's the kind of laughter that would be going on here. Oh yeah, so funny, I forgot to laugh. And here's Sarah, adrift in a world of men, surrounded by men. And she laughs in her heart. And it's at the door of the tent, and if you begin with verse 9, the story starts to change from one of just hospitality to the focus upon laughter. Beginning right there. I don't know how many of you remember The Princess Bride. It was a movie from long ago, but there are lots of people who remember it. And she laughs, and I think of Vizzini, the guy in that movie, who says repeatedly when strange things happen, inconceivable. And I'm sure that's exactly the reaction that Sarah had. That's inconceivable in more ways than one. Then she denies having said anything in her heart. What Sarah thinks to herself, however, is, I'm going to end up being the only woman in the maternity ward on Medicare. I don't know how you'd feel about that, but she did not feel real strongly that it could happen. And then God makes good on the promise. And Sarah is not disparaged either by her husband or by God. Instead, the child is named Isaac, which means, laughter, or he laughs. It's a way of reminding us again and again of our own foibles, of our own refusal to believe because facts stand in the way. I remember thinking as a kid, my parents would invite neighbors in or friends over for dinner, and we kids were fed ahead of time. And then the adults sat down and they had, drinks of that time, old fashions and whiskey sours and things that are now kind of by the wayside. And they sat around, and my sisters and I would listen in on the conversations, and we said to one another, grown-ups laugh at the weirdest things. I try to remember to recapture what it felt like as a child when there was honesty in my laughter, and very direct honesty. And yet they laughed at things that didn't seem to make any connection with me at all. Kids do have an honesty in their laughter. When adults laugh, there is also a sense of absurdity in it. An absurdity that often comes from our experience, and we recognize the disconnect between promises and their fulfillment. Laughter can be a serious business. I don't know how many of you remember Abbott and Costello, who were funny guys, but they were very serious when it came to business. Abbott and Costello took out a $100,000 life insurance policy, which would apply to any member of any of their audiences who died laughing. Literally died laughing. I'd say that'd be a great way to go. And Søren Kierkegaard, who was a philosopher, a Danish philosopher of the 19th century, his claim was that laughter was the boundary line of religious existence. It's the boundary line between one being religious and one being just ethical. Because ethics can be deadly serious and extremely rigid in many cases. There's this and nothing more. But the boundary line of religious experience, he said, was laughter. Being able to laugh at oneself. To be able to laugh with good friends who all recognized their own foibles. And the fact is, lots of us, if we don't laugh, I'm afraid our hearts would just break. It's the boundary line, the connection, hospitality and humor. That's not a throwaway line when one says, God has a sense of humor. We say it as a throwaway line. It's not. God does have a sense of humor. And on this Father's Day, I'd like you to do something just mentally. Not everyone had fathers that were admirable. Not everyone had fathers that actually helped raise them. But nearly all of us have had someone who served that function for us, whether consciously or unconsciously. Someone who knew what it was to be hospitable to us, who knew what it was like to laugh with us. And I'd like you to focus on that person for just a moment or two. And if that person is still alive, I hope you plan on making connection with them today. Our sign outside, the electronic one, says, "We choose welcome." It's most certainly a choice. We can choose not to be welcoming. And when we say to ourselves, we choose welcome, it's for sure. Do we, like Abraham, just spring right up when people show up? We also have to choose, who is it we're going to welcome? Is it going to be just people who look like us, who feel the same way we do about things, who toe the same line politically and economically? God has a sense of humor. And I want you to think about the things in your life that are really pretty funny. If I were to have looked ahead in my life, I would find it incredibly funny that I'm a preacher. And I would have probably denied it. I would find it incredibly funny that I was a father and still am one. It may be funny for you to think in terms of what your vocation was, or whether you got married, or whether you made some sort of huge glaring mistake somewhere along the way that turned into something really, really good. God has a sense of humor. And I think that Jesus was one of the ways that God kind of laughed at us and with us, to come among us, to be with us, to be present, and to be able to see what we see, the sometimes absurd things that happen to us, and the power of hospitality, and the power of laughter. Inconceivable, we say in our heads. But that's the point. That's the point. It's inconceivable that God would care. It's so funny. Let's not forget to laugh. Amen.